everybody. My name is Liz DeWicki, and I'm Manager of Communications and Digital Strategies at the Epilepsy Foundation. Thank you so much for hanging out and waiting with us as we figured out the tech. This is the COVID-19 Facebook Live on the vaccine. So first, I just want to open and say that since last spring, we've all been living through a very uncertain and often scary time. It's important to me to acknowledge where you all may be coming from attending this event. But today we're here to talk about hope on the horizon with the arrival of this vaccine that we'll be discussing today. As a reminder, we are not able to address individual medical concerns or provide individual advice. I want to introduce our amazing speakers who all have received the vaccine. Dr. Elaine Worrell is the Director of Pediatric Epilepsy and Professor of Neurology at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. She is also our co-editor-in-chief of epilepsy.com. Dr. Jackie French is the Epilepsy Foundation's Chief Medical and Innovation Officer. She is also a professor in the New York University Department of Neurology and Comprehensive Epilepsy Center. Dr. Freimau is part of the COVID-19 management team at Cooper University Hospital. He is also Associate Professor of Medicine at Cooper Medical School of Rowan University. Dr. Freimau treats patients with COVID-19 and coordinates the COVID-19 response at Cooper University Hospital. So first I want to ask you, Dr. Freimau, what does a vaccine do and how does the COVID-19 vaccine work?
So vaccines, of which we have had many over the years for a wide variety of infections, are designed to help boost the immune system to prevent either infection or disease from an infectious agent. For example, we've had vaccines for mumps and measles and chickenpox for many years. There are vaccines for pneumonia that people get when they turn 65. And of course, there's the flu vaccine we've had for many, many years as well. The vaccines that we now have for COVID, the ones that are available now in the United States are novel vaccines in terms of the way that they've been made. The net result is the same. They boost your immune system by making antibodies to help prevent the COVID virus from attaching and causing disease. But the technology that's in them is a little bit different and has only been available through breakthroughs in science over the last several years.
Wow, that's amazing. So another question for you. So there are two vaccines available right now in the United States. Can you talk about each of them? And should I get one over the other? I haven't been vaccinated yet.
So we have these two vaccines. You've all heard about them. One is the Pfizer vaccine, and the other is the Moderna vaccine. The thing that's most important is that these two vaccines are much more similar than they are different. They both use the same new technology, which is what we call messenger RNA or mRNA technology. Unlike a lot of the vaccines that we've used before, where you either get a killed part of the infecting organism or even a live infectious organism, here what you're putting in is some of the genetic programming material, the messenger RNA. It goes into your body. It then makes your body produce the virus particles in your muscle cells, not the entire virus, but just the most important part of the virus that your body tries to make antibodies to. And by giving you that, your body produces antibodies. So if you come in contact with the virus itself, you won't get infected because you already have those antibodies in abundance. Both of these two vaccines use the same technique for getting that messenger RNA into your body. The messenger RNA then gets broken down very quickly, but your body then goes ahead and makes these antibodies. This is different than the old vaccines, and there are other COVID vaccines in development that use more traditional techniques. Both of these vaccines seem to be equally effective. In fact, it's surprising how similar they are in the studies and how well they worked. They both prevented disease in the people who had received them at a level of about 95%, which we think is extraordinarily good and even far better than we had hoped. And I'm not usually very optimistic, but when we saw these results, we were really happy. Um, the major difference between the two vaccines really has to do with their practical rollout. One of the vaccines, the Pfizer vaccine, has to be stored at minus 80 degrees. There aren't that many minus 80-degree freezers out there, so the storage is a much bigger challenge, and it has to be maintained, can only be outside of that freezer for a couple of days at cold temperatures. The Moderna virus can be stored at a more typical freezer temperature, so it's able to be rolled out more quickly to places that don't have that specialized capacity. The other practical difference is the spacing between the two doses. Both of these viruses are designed to be
You mean
given,
vaccines?
these vaccines, yes, we try not to give viruses, we prefer to give vaccines. Both of these vaccines are designed to be given as two doses. You get your first dose, and then X number of weeks later, you get the second dose. The Pfizer vaccine is 3 weeks, the Moderna vaccine is 4 weeks. And those are really the practical differences. The side effect profiles appear to be identical. The effectiveness appears to be identical. So there's no real reason why anyone would pick and choose one or the other. And in fact, we're just happy to have the availability to give any of them to people.
Yeah, it's amazing that we have these, in such, we got them so quickly. So I would love to hear more. How were these developed and how did they get approved so quickly?
So you've all heard the term Operation Warp Speed, right? And that conveys an image that we rocketed these out there and sort of disregarded all the normal things that we do when we make a vaccine. And that's not the case at all. There are pieces of the process of creating, developing, testing, and then manufacturing a vaccine, some of which can be speeded up and some of which can't. First of all, the messenger RNA technology that enabled us to make these vaccines enabled the vaccines themselves to be, the initial prototypes were designed in a day or two. So unlike older vaccines, which would take months and months of development, they already had vaccines to start working with within a couple of days. Um, so that part of the and then you can scale that up and manufacture these much more quickly. What a big chunk of what Operation Warp Speed did was that the government gambled that these vaccines were worth making, and they enabled the manufacturers to make large quantities of vaccine even before it had been fully tested. Now, that's a good thing because as soon as it's tested and the test and found to be safe and effective, you then have vaccine to ship out right away. Normally, you would test the vaccine, get your results, and then the pharmaceutical companies would say, okay, now let's go make this. Here, because they made it ahead of time, and there were several other vaccines that were also made ahead of time, once they're effective, you can get them out much more quickly. And that cost was part of what the government gambled would be helpful by allowing us to get these out that much faster. Now, the critical part of assessing a vaccine are the clinical trials where we look at safety and efficacy. I know many of you are familiar with clinical trials. Dr. French and Dr. Worrell both are expert in clinical trials of epilepsy medications. With vaccines, there is a very standard process of how these vaccines are tested, and they have to be shown to be effective. And in order to be effective, you have to have enough people who actually get the disease who weren't vaccinated so that you can know that the vaccine prevented it in the other group. And all vaccines have to undergo a minimum of 8 weeks of safety testing so that you know that for those first 8 weeks, nothing bad happened. And that's standard for the process of all vaccine development. Those two steps, the effectiveness testing and the safety testing, were not compromised at all. They went along the standard path of development. But when we got to the point where the FDA looked at these vaccines and said, gee, these really work and they look safe, the day later is when the trucks started to ship the vaccine out. And that's why they were able to get the vaccine out so quickly.
Thank you. That's so helpful to know. I think, we don't always know how these things come to our door, so it's great to hear about the process, and it's part of how our epilepsy medicines are created too. So first, I want to switch over to you, Dr. French. So who should get the vaccine?
So we've been looking, and of course, everything is not known yet. But and one thing I wanted to add to what Dr. Framow said was people think 8 weeks. That's not long enough. I mean, with seizure medicines, everybody is very worried about long-term side effects. Well, I feel okay now, but we know that in 2 years I'm going to have this side effect of the drug or that side effect of the drug. And we know that trials for seizure medicines have to be much longer than 8 weeks. So what's going on there? But the thing is that, as Dr. Framow said, this is just something that's in your body for a very short period of time. And then it's like as if you had the disease, right? It's making your body recognize the virus particle so that next time it sees it, it's going to be ready and it's going to punch it out. And just as, when you've had COVID and, you have immunity for a long time after that, just seeing this little tiny piece of the virus that your own body makes with the messenger RNA is enough to set that recognition system up, and that's going to be in operation for a long time. So I think Dr. Framow will agree with this, but we don't expect from vaccines. I mean, we've had, as Dr. Framow said, many, many, many vaccines over time, and none of them that I am aware of have had long-term side effects. It's really what happens in the first 8 weeks is where the money is. Is that correct, Dr. Framow?
That's correct. For the vaccines that we see, the overwhelming majority of adverse effects are readily apparent, even much less than 8 weeks. So 8 weeks is a typical time for any vaccine that's developed. I think what you can't tell right away, but we actually have more information than that now, is that, remember, these vaccines were tested in 30,000 people, plus minus. So if there are very, very unusual effects, you probably don't see that right away. But we've now given these vaccines to 5+ million people in the United States. So we have a lot more information on the safety of these vaccines for things that would be extremely unusual. I mean, we know a little bit more now about some people who develop allergic reactions, which happens with any vaccine or any product. And we know those numbers are very low, but you might not have seen that when you look at 30,000 people. But when you look at millions and millions of people, you'll start to see some of those much, much less common effects. But we don't expect that we're going to see things that are longer than 8 weeks in terms of those long-term potential complications.
And, because this is such an unusual circumstance, when a seizure medicine comes out, it takes, many, many, many years to know what happens in millions of people who take the drug. So we get some surprises a few years down the road because we're still accumulating those millions of people. But, now around the world, really, people have been carefully watching the millions and millions of people who have already taken this drug. And that is a really good way to see if there are going to be any unexpected safety issues, and there haven't been. But having said that, you asked me who should take it. So let's start out by saying that so far there have not been studies in two groups. One is, depending on which vaccine you're talking about, people under the age of 16 or 18. So the Pfizer vaccine is approved down to 16. The Moderna vaccine is approved down to 18. And we don't know anything about children yet, but they are, going on with trials right now of children so that children will be able to take it in the near future. And the second group that we don't have enough information about, and that has caused a lot of questions, is women who are pregnant or who don't know if they're pregnant, are planning pregnancy sometime in the near future. We do know, however, that of the millions of healthcare workers who have already been vaccinated, there are quite a few who are pregnant amongst them. So you ask yourself, why would someone who is pregnant go ahead and get the vaccine when I just told you we don't have enough information about that group? And what these people had in mind when they went ahead and got the vaccine is that what we don't know is the small likelihood that this is going to be harmful to a baby, because vaccines usually are not. What we do know is that COVID-19 is harmful to mothers and babies. And so you're going with the harm that you do know versus the very, very, very low likelihood of harm that you don't know. And I want to remind everybody out here, although it like astounds even me to say it, that at this point in time, it's estimated that 1 out of 16 people in America have had COVID-19, whether they've had symptoms from it or not. And, to say, well, I don't know what the long-term side effects of the vaccine are, is one thing. To say, I don't know what the long-term side effects of COVID-19 are, well, we know that some people are experiencing long-term side effects already, but we have no idea whether there's more coming down the road. So there's just as much uncertainty about what's going to happen to you long-term with COVID-19, but some of the uncertainty is gone because already we know that a number of people who have had COVID-19 have scars in their body that are going to last for the rest of their lives. Doc, I don't know if you want to comment on that, Dr. Fremow.
Yeah, so we know that COVID-19 in many people is a mild illness, but in others it's not. And in some of those people, they get severely ill, they require hospitalization, some of them die. And not all of those people are people who are elderly or have underlying immune or other predisposing conditions. We see occasional young, healthy people who come in and get severely ill. And maybe it's because there are differences in the way their body may handle the virus. So that's one group of people. And anybody who gets severely ill with COVID, some of those people have late complications. The other thing that we recognize is that there are what they call the long haulers, or people who've been infected with COVID who seem to have symptoms that last 3 months, 6 months, going on now, some of them 9 months, and they still don't feel right. They still feel tired and they feel miserable. And, that's something that if you can prevent that, it's worth doing. And back to the pregnancy issue, we know how devastating COVID infection can be in pregnancy. We have a couple of women in our hospital now who are postpartum and are still on ventilators weeks after their episode of COVID infection. So it can be very devastating. We know what the consequences are. We don't know the full picture. It can't possibly be better than what we know already.
Right. And just to finish and round out the question that you asked, people want to know, the people who are listening tonight are people who have epilepsy. So they want to know, is there something about my medicine or something about having seizures that should give me pause more than other people in regards to taking this vaccine? And what I can tell you now is that there is no scientific reason to believe that there would be a concern. And, obviously not enough people with epilepsy have taken it so that I could sit here and tell you, I know 100,000 people with epilepsy who have taken it and everything's been fine. I will say that if 7 million people have taken it and we know that 1 in 26 people has epilepsy, I can guarantee you that people with epilepsy have taken it. We don't know who they are, but we know they're out there. And so far, we have not heard, sirens going off that any of those people have had problems afterwards. So again, it's weighing off the consequences of not taking the vaccine versus the consequences of taking it. And I'm just going to say very quickly that those consequences is not only to our personal health, but the fact that we need 80%, well, maybe up to 80%, 70 to 80% of people in America to either take the vaccine or unfortunately get COVID before we develop what you've heard about, herd immunity, and we can all get back to our lives with, restaurants open, people having their jobs, taking public transportation, which for epilepsy is so important and has been taken away. All of these things that we used to take for granted, we can't get back to until 70 to 80% of us take the vaccine.
Yeah, we're all really in this together. Like, we're trying to get everybody trained in seizure first aid. We really need folks to get vaccinated so we all can be protected and be safe out there. I want to thank G. Lynn, Cindy, David, and Ingrid for giving some Facebook stars for the Facebook Live. So if you are benefiting from this content, please send us stars. We love seeing those. I want to ask you, Dr. French. Oh no, I'm going to go to Dr. Whirl. What do people with epilepsy need to know about the vaccine? Whether it's, was it tested on people with epilepsy? Does it affect certain seizure medications? What do people with epilepsy need to know and be asking their providers?
Yeah, so I would echo what Dr. French has already said, is that, we don't have a big study that says, 1 million people or 100,000 with epilepsy that have been vaccinated. But again, looking at the numbers, we know that there's a significant number who actually have already received the vaccine. I think the other thing is that we know that epilepsy in itself is not a high risk condition, but many people with epilepsy can have other conditions that would make them higher risk. So people with severe cerebral palsy or any lung or breathing issues. And we do know that, while the highest risk of severe disease and death seems to be in the older individuals or those with high risk medical conditions, we have certainly seen many individuals who would be considered low risk and younger individuals who have gotten really sick and who have actually died as a result of COVID. So I think persons with epilepsy, regardless of whether you have other high risk conditions, are certainly not exempt from getting really, really sick with COVID. I think the other important thing is the impact of COVID in persons with epilepsy that extends beyond just the infection. So, for all of us, the pandemic has really impacted the way we normally live our lives, our ability to socialize with our friends and get out and do things. And so certainly we see an increase in mental health issues, and that's a problem for many people, but I think even potentially maybe even more prone to persons who have epilepsy. There was a recent study from New York that suggested that many people with epilepsy have a lot more anxiety during the pandemic, and that's anxiety about, what might happen if I get infected, or what's my risk of infection. That's anxiety with regards to, can I get my medication? Maybe somebody's going to run out of medication, or can I, get the services that I need? Can I actually get to my doctor's appointments? And so that anxiety is certainly not good for people who have seizures as well. So many people can actually have an increase in their seizures just as a result of the anxiety that has been brought on by the pandemic. I'm a child neurologist, and the other thing that I've seen is many of my patients have not been able to access the normal therapies that they get. And so you can imagine that these these children who really require therapies 2 or 3 times a week, and suddenly those are not available to them. They're, in school, and they're not now in school. They're on the other side of Zoom, and it doesn't work very well for many persons who have special needs from the therapist. So I think we all need to recognize the important impact that COVID has had outside of just the infection, and do what we can to get this pandemic under control. I think, as Dr. French has said, the vaccines do appear to be very safe. We don't think that they are higher risk for persons with epilepsy than the general public. And so we really strongly recommend that people with epilepsy do get the vaccine.
Thank you for saying that. We have a lot of concerns in the comments about seizure medications. Is there any concern with seizure medications in the vaccine?
So I think that when we look at seizure medications, there's no one seizure medication that would contraindicate the vaccine. I think one of the biggest potential concerns are people who have autoimmune related conditions that can lead to epilepsy, or some individuals with epilepsy are treated with medications that impact the immune system, usually suppress the immune system. And what we know is that the vaccine seems to be quite safe in those individuals. And so the recommendation generally is that persons with autoimmune conditions, or persons who are on medications that modulate the immune system, would still go ahead and get the vaccine. Obviously, if you're in that group, it makes sense for you to talk to your healthcare provider and make sure your questions are answered. But the general recommendation is that they would go ahead and get the vaccine. We know that with the vaccine, that persons who are on chronic immune therapies like high dose steroids may have a somewhat attenuated response to the vaccine, meaning that the vaccine may not be as effective in those individuals as those who did not have any suppression of their immune system. But I think for many people, we still see that the vaccine can be very, very effective, and does probably provide the majority of those individuals a significant degree of protection against severe COVID. So we don't know of a medication that would be contraindicated. Dr. French, any other comments you'd like to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think people are always hearing that their seizure medicines are interfering with other medicines. And I bet that there's some concern out there. Well, if I'm on, this medicine or that medicine, I've been told I have to ask about every other medicine I take, that it might not work. But this is not a medicine, the vaccine, that is going to not work because you're on a seizure medicine, other than these autoimmune therapies that aren't really standard anti-seizure drugs. So don't worry. I'm just here to say, don't worry that this vaccine is not going to work because you're taking Keppra, or because you're taking carbamazepine, Tegretol, Dilantin, whatever. It's going to work just as well.
Thank you. We're getting tons of stars on Facebook, too many people to name. So thank you, everybody, for your support, and for our speakers for being here. A question popped up that I would really like to address, because I think it's really important. As I mentioned earlier, this has been a scary time, and with these new vaccines, it's offers a lot of hope, but people are still having some anxiety, about getting a vaccine. What advice do you have, Dr. French, I'll pitch this to you, about how to cope with this anxiety about getting the vaccine?
Well, I will just tell you this, that if you look around the country, the first people that are jumping up in the highest, percentage that agree to get the vaccine are the doctors. And, you would think it would be the nurses, because the nurses are the ones that are like on the front lines and are maybe most likely to catch it. Some doctors too are like really in the face of it. But all doctors, whether they're like working in the offices or whether they're working in the hospital, they are jumping to get the vaccine. And that's because they do understand the science, and they understand that these vaccines are safe and effective. So, I think that we voted with our feet. The three people who are sitting here in front of you, all of us were very happy to put our arms out and get the vaccine. We're not going to be able to allay all your anxieties, but I think, again, the fact that millions of people have now taken them, And yes, I know some people may be concerned. I know there is another, by the way, issue. I don't know whether you're seeing it in the chat that I have heard, which is I've had an allergic reaction to my seizure medicine. Does that mean I will have an allergic reaction to the vaccine? And the answer is there's no reason to believe because you had a skin rash to a seizure medicine that that is going to make you, and I'll turn to Dr. Frameau here, but my understanding is that kind of reaction to a seizure medicine is not going to increase the likelihood that you have an allergic reaction to the vaccine. There are some people who like have what we call anaphylactic reactions to other vaccines and other drugs, and they're the ones that we worry about more. Would you say that's correct, Dr. Frameau?
Yeah, I mean, I think initially when the first day or two that the vaccine rolled out, there were a couple of reports of these more serious allergic type anaphylactic reactions. And they do happen very rarely with the vaccine. Things that we mostly warn people about are people who have had those kinds of reactions to other vaccines or other injectable medications. It really has very little to do with people who are allergic to penicillin or allergic to other oral medicines that they take. It really seems to be much more related to that. Um, we know that when we dispense the vaccines in our hospital, the only difference that we do for people who have a history of those kinds of allergic reactions to other things is that instead of the 15 minutes that all of us are supposed to sit there after the vaccine and be really bored while we're waiting to be released, they keep you there for a half an hour and have you be even more bored while they wait for you to be released. So those events are very, very small. Like all vaccines, some people react more than others to the vaccine. All three of us have had at least one dose of the vaccine. I actually had my second dose last week, and I can tell you the second dose did give me more of a reaction than the first dose, and that's what we've been told. My first dose, I had a little bit of arm soreness and nothing else. My second dose that night, I felt a little bit fluish, didn't have a fever, and my symptoms were better by the next day. And I think for many in my hospital that I work with, since many of us are at that time where we're getting our second doses, that's usually the case. We had a little bit more symptoms the second go round, but generally not very problematic. And I can only think of one person who missed work the next day because of their vaccine symptoms.
And one thing I know people are also worried about is that sometimes you can have a high fever with the second dose. Again, that's the minority, but it can happen. If people's seizures have been triggered by fever, then you might want to talk to your doctor about that, about being prepared for that, what you want to do about that. That's a very personal thing you should talk to your doctor about.
So just to go back to what you said before about having someone wait a little bit longer, I've had to do that for some vaccines because sometimes I get a little dizzy. So if someone's had an allergic reaction to the flu vaccine, what would you recommend? They, of course, should talk to their provider, but then they might just need to wait a little bit longer after getting the COVID vaccine.
The way that most of the vaccine centers are set up and the guidance from the CDC for vaccine administration is that's part of the history that they elicit from you when you come to get the vaccine. And if you are one of those people who have that sort of history, then just the standard protocol is that they will keep you that extra period of time. In fact, they probably are overly cautious and keep more people for that extra period of time than they probably really need to. But but the goal is to be cautious. We're trying to be very cautious here because it is a new vaccine. But even with all of the intense scrutiny that we've had, you haven't heard any horrendous reports about how terrible the vaccine is now that some 7 million or more people in the United States have gotten it, and who knows how many more if you count England and some of the other countries where this vaccine is also being given.
So talking about caution, I had a question for you, Dr. Frameau. After we get the vaccine, can we go to life as it was before? Can we go to no masks, acting like we were before COVID hit?
So we would like to say yes, but we can't. And the reason why we can't yet is this. First of all, even if the vaccine's a great vaccine and 95% of people respond, there's still 5% of people who don't respond. So you can't presume that just because you've been vaccinated, you're immune. The other part is a little harder to explain, but let me try. We know that the vaccine prevents you from getting sick from COVID. The way the studies were done, they looked at people, 30,000 people who didn't get the vaccine, 30,000 who did, and looked to see how many of those people got sick with COVID and how many of them got severely ill. And that's why we know that the vaccine was 95% effective in preventing people from getting sick with COVID. We don't know how many of those people who got the vaccine potentially could have had asymptomatic cases of COVID. They picked up the virus, they could still potentially transmit it, even though they never got sick. We don't think that happened, but the studies weren't really designed to be able to answer that question. So that remains a question mark. If you get the vaccine, is it still possible that you could have an asymptomatic infection and still spread it to other people? And that's why we're going to keep wearing masks and assume the worst until we have more information that tells us that that's not happening.
So keep wearing masks, folks. You heard it here first. Important to keep wearing masks and social distancing. So I have one more question, and then I'm going to go to the chat to pull some more questions for our speakers. So my last question is, when can I, a person with epilepsy, get the vaccine? And why are some people getting the vaccine before me? Dr. Frameau, I'm going to give that one to you.
So the vaccine is being rolled out in phases, but some of the implementation of what's happening is occurring. Each state is different because it has a different rollout plan. And in some states, even each county is different in terms of how they're rolling these vaccines out. We know that the initial phase, the 1A phase, was healthcare workers, and that's healthcare workers of all kinds. That includes the people who work in environmental services and in food services, the technicians in the lab, as well as doctors and nurses and people on the floors. In addition, the other highest priority group were people in long-term care facilities. We know that they were disproportionately affected. In the first several months, over 40% of the people who died of COVID were people from long-term care facilities. So those folks and the folks who care for them in those facilities are also being vaccinated now. In some states, they have started the next phase. The next phase is certain types of essential workers. Right now, it would be police and fire and other emergency management folks. In other states, it's a little bit different. But the next phases will include individuals at highest risk for severe disease, and some of that's based on age and pre-existing conditions. Some of that is also people like teachers who form essential functions so that they can go back into the schools and do their jobs. Or people who, in New York City, a big focus is on the people who are the subway workers and bus workers there so that they can keep the public transit running. So you'll see slightly different patterns of what happens next in different places. But we know that all of these will be rolled out sequentially. The people who are least likely to get the vaccine first are healthy 20, 25-year-olds who have no pre-existing conditions and don't work in any of the essential services. But we know that over the next several months, there'll be millions and millions more doses of vaccine available, and we will be able to vaccinate large proportion of the population.
Thank you. There are some people with epilepsy in congregate settings, so people with epilepsy in those settings will get the vaccine during that phase. And Sarah, if you could put in the chat, Sarah's our amazing moderator and running our tech. We have a whole article about COVID-19 vaccine, and it lays out really nicely a lot of the questions we're getting in the chat. But I'm going to start going to the questions in the chat. One question is, Dr. Freeman, I'm going to give this to you. Will the vaccine give us COVID?
No, absolutely not. So the messenger RNA that they use in the vaccine doesn't shove the whole virus, doesn't make your body make the entire virus. You are making one protein of that virus called the spike protein. And that virus, that's not enough to make whole viruses. You're making that single protein only. You can't possibly replicate that and make a whole virus and get sick and have the disease just from that single protein.
Thank you. Dr. Worrell, I have a question for you. Someone asked, they understand that the vaccine is not available for children, but when it is approved, would a child with epilepsy be recommended to get the vaccine?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, kids with epilepsy are probably going to be at similar risk as other individuals, unless there's other factors that make them higher risk, such as bad cerebral palsy or something like that. But certainly we would recommend, as soon as it is shown to be safe and effective in children, that if you are a child with epilepsy, I would recommend getting it as quickly as possible.
Another question I had is, Dr. Freeman, I'll give this one to you. If someone has a protein deficiency, is there any concern with getting the vaccine?
No, not at this time. Again, the major concerns are not necessarily that there is going to be any damage or any increased likelihood that the vaccine will harm you. The only thing we don't know in a lot of different populations with a lot of different types of diseases is we just don't know if the vaccine will be quite as effective as it is in other groups. But there is no increased risk from getting the vaccine from people with protein deficiencies or other problems.
Someone is also wondering if you are allergic to shellfish, if you can get the vaccine. I hadn't heard this. Is there any relation there?
No, that's not an issue at all. And nor is eggs an issue, because this is really one of the big advantages of this vaccine. Unlike the flu vaccine that we're used to, that used to be made exclusively in eggs, which is part of the reason why it was such a tedious and time-consuming process. This vaccine isn't made in eggs. Does not use any human proteins. It does not use any animal proteins. In fact, I heard one of the rumors that I heard was whether or not there were any pig or porcine products that were used in the manufacturing of the vaccine, and there are none. So all of those things that people might be allergic to, that wouldn't be relevant here.
Thank you. So I also wanted to mention that Raquel, who is joining our Facebook Live, is 10 years seizure-free today. So congrats, Raquel. That's really exciting. So we touched on this, but I want to just ask it more directly for our audience. So I'll give this to you, Dr. French. Have people with seizures, was the vaccine tested on people with seizures?
There was only a couple of groups, and they were really picked because they were at high risk from COVID. People with cardiovascular disease, people with HIV, people with lung disease specifically, and some people I think with liver disease. So those were sort of the big groups, and then people who were older, over 65 and then over 75, who were singled out in the trials as we want to see whether this was safe and whether it was effective and whether it had that 95% likelihood of working. And it was the same across the board. It was equally as safe and effective. So that was really good to see, particularly in older people who sometimes don't mount the same kind of immune response as younger people. But there are so many different chronic conditions. I mean, if you think about it, people can have, even among neurology, they can have multiple sclerosis or Parkinson's disease or epilepsy. I mean, there just would have been impossible in the 30,000 people who were tested in the clinical trial to get enough people in each of those groups. So we don't know the answer about whether there were any people with epilepsy in the study, and if so, what happened to them. But as I said before, now we have a history of millions of people who took it, and no evidence. Nobody has come forward, and you know how the press loves these things. The press is just waiting to hear bad news. We haven't heard anything about seizures as a result of, I will, by the way, just mention one case in South America where an individual had a seizure but had an encephalitis, which might not have been related to the vaccine at all. But that was not a person who had had epilepsy before they took the vaccine. So no reports yet of people saying that they had a seizure, people with epilepsy, or that their seizures got worse.
We had a question, and I will give this to you, Dr. French. Can a person who had Guillain-Barre syndrome in the past,
Guillain-Barre.
thank you,
Yeah. So
can they
people
get the
are worried
vaccine?
about that. Yeah. Right now, and maybe I'll have Dr. Fremow confirm, but right now the guidance says those people can have the vaccine. Another concern that people may have heard is about a Bell's palsy, which is a face paralysis after the vaccine. That has been seen a couple of times. I've spoken to my neurologic colleagues because we are neurologists before we're epileptologists, and that comes under the purview of a neurologic disease. And believe it or not, if you look at the number of people who have that face paralysis every year in America, when there's no vaccine and no COVID, and you compare it to the number of people who have been vaccinated, the number that have popped up is about what you would expect. So right now, there is no big signal saying that that face paralysis was a consequence of getting a vaccine. Some things can happen after you get a vaccine that are not a consequence of the vaccine. They would have happened anyway. And it's starting to look like that's the case with the face paralysis, although we'll have to wait a little longer to confirm that. And Dr. Fremow, you would agree that Guillain-Barre is not what we call a contraindication. You would still go ahead and get it.
I would say that's correct. I would say, though, that it is, again, there are some things that we just don't have the information to definitively answer. And it may also depend on how you acquired your Guillain-Barre like illness. If, rarely this can occur in association with, there was one particular flu vaccine some 30 years ago that led to an increased incidence of Guillain-Barre. But most cases of Guillain-Barre have nothing to do with vaccination. They have to do with illnesses and viruses or intestinal infections. So there would be no reason to presume that this vaccine would cause another episode.
And by the way, I just want to say for everybody who doesn't know that Guillain-Barre is a temporary paralysis of the muscles through the nerves. And so it's kind of related to the facial paralysis that's also related to a specific nerve but they're both temporary, and both of them ultimately resolve and recover for the most part. So even if one were, in worst case scenario, to get another case of Guillain-Barre or to get a facial paralysis, the vast majority of people would then get over that and recover.
Thank you. That gets to a larger question, and we're getting different variations of this in the chat for just different conditions all over the place. So Dr. French, is there anyone who should not get the vaccine?
Well, right now, as I said, children and pregnant women, that is a discussion, children, it's not approved for. Pregnant women is a discussion that you can have with, your spouse, your OBGYN or whoever. But other than that, right now, again, the only concern, and I think Dr. Frameout put that very well, is that in some populations, you might have less of a protection, but most likely you have some, and there's no evidence that it's going to hurt you. So you get some help and it doesn't hurt you, then the answer is that you should go ahead and get it. So right now, we are not aware of any population, unless Dr. Frameau knows of any, that we would say, don't get the vaccine.
So the other thing is that if you have had COVID, and we know that at least 20 million people in the United States have, probably a lot more than that, that is not a contraindication or a reason not to get the vaccine. The vaccine is recommended for people who have had and recovered from COVID because we expect that the immunity that you get will be even better after the vaccination. The only question is how long to wait after you've had COVID. Early on, the first recommendations were waiting a couple of months. That was more based on practicality because people who've had COVID have good antibody levels and are considered to be very unlikely to get infected again in the next 3 months. But you don't have to wait 3 months to get the shot. And in fact, we recently changed our employee vaccination policy that once you're recovered from your infection and doing okay, you can get the vaccine.
And people who have just been vaccinated should wait before they get another vaccine. I just talked to somebody who's had 4 vaccines within the last 6 months, and he's in a clinical trial for seeing how the vaccines interact with each other.
Right, and that's not on the basis of any data either, that the vaccines would interfere with each other. But we generally tell people not to get them at the same time. But that's probably most worrisome if you're going to get a live vaccine, like the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, because we know that live vaccines can transiently weaken your immune system, and they might be more likely to make you have a less effective response to the COVID vaccine. Not because there's any harm in the vaccines making you sick or anything like that. You just might not respond as well to the COVID vaccine at the same time as another vaccine.
One of the questions that we got is if you have an allergic reaction and it's not while you're waiting shortly after getting the vaccine, what should you do and how would you know if you're having an allergic reaction? Dr. Frameau, could you answer that one?
So most allergic reactions are, the most serious ones are you might have immediate swelling of your arm, you might have some mild swelling or itching in your face. Very, very rarely, some people might feel some chest tightness. The most severe allergic reactions, which have been extraordinarily rare from this, would be people who might feel their throat tightening. But most of the more severe reactions are really the arm swelling and sometimes itching and face swelling. And they generally occur within that half-hour period. So that's why they keep you for that half hour, to make sure that you're not having one of those more severe reactions.
How about face fillers? Do you recommend people who've had facial fillers get the vaccine?
I don't think it's a contraindication.
So here's an interesting question, and one I hadn't thought of. So do we know what the future of this vaccine is going to look like? So for a flu shot, we get the flu shot every year. So should we expect to need to get this COVID-19 vaccine every year? Dr. Frameout, is that something we know yet?
We don't know the answer to that yet. The current modeling and thinking are that this vaccine should be effective for at least a year. But until we follow people longer than we've followed them for now, for all the people in the clinical trials, we're obviously nowhere near that length of time. It's hard to say what's going to happen. The other thing we don't know the answer to is, you've all heard, I'm sure, on the news about virus variants, right? The viruses change over time. That's the natural history of viruses. And we've seen no evidence so far that any of these new variants are less likely to be prevented by the vaccine, but that would be something that they're closely monitoring, because that might be something that you might need to tweak the virus like we have to do with flu. On the other hand, these viruses could give long-lasting protection for years, and that is obviously the best case scenario, because the longer that protection lasts, the more likely and the sooner the virus is to sort of disappear from the population.
So if someone, to go back to the allergic reaction, if someone has an allergic reaction, what should they do? Should they go to the emergency room? Should they call 911? What would you recommend one do if they're starting to have that allergic reaction to the vaccine?
If they're having an allergic reaction or feel like they're having an allergic reaction, depending, I mean, if they're having symptoms like throat tightening, difficulty breathing, then they should immediately call 911, or go to the emergency room if they are very close to an emergency room. Most of the other reactions, may involve, first step would be a call. Most of these centers that provide the vaccines also want to know if you're having a reaction, and they can help give you advice. I know at our hospital, if we have any reactions at all, we call them and they will tell us what to do. So,
Thank you. There are some folks that are concerned about if they have an allergic reaction, what should they do? So that information is really helpful for them. Dr. Worrell, are there any side effects with the vaccine with CBD or medical marijuana?
So we don't know that there is any side effects, and I would say the likelihood that there would be any side effects would be exceedingly low. I don't think that there is any problems whatsoever if you're on CBD or medical marijuana for you to get the vaccine. I would strongly recommend that you do.
Great, thank you. Another question, someone was told that you should get one vaccine over the other. I just want to reemphasize that there is no reason to get one over the other.
yeah, I think this happens in our vaccine site as well. People come in and they've heard something in the news. Sometimes they'll hear something in the news because it's new and we know about it with one vaccine. We just don't know about it yet with the other. For example, last week, Pfizer had studies that showed that it was effective against the variant virus. We just don't have those studies yet. There's no reason to think the Moderna vaccine wouldn't also be effective. It's just that the company didn't put out those studies. So people immediately jump on that information and say, that means this vaccine must be better. There's been no convincing data of any significant difference in how either the reactions to the vaccines or the effectiveness of the two vaccines we have now.
Thank you. We have a question about why people with epilepsy, just epilepsy alone, are not considered high risk. One of the reasons people are asking this is that for some people, fever comes with seizures, and COVID-19 can cause fever. Dr. French, can you comment as to why people with epilepsy are not considered high risk?
So yes, there are some people whose seizures are worse with fever. They're not everybody with epilepsy. And, we've just been surveilling for quite a while now. And we also, since we both, Dr. Worrell and I work in epilepsy centers, and we also have sort of like a network of people who work in epilepsy centers, and some people with very bad epilepsy. And we were prepared for the onslaught of people who were going to call and say, my epilepsy's worse, I have COVID, my epilepsy's worse. And unfortunately, we all have many, many patients who have now experienced COVID. And we never got those calls. And so we just have not seen, and that's great news, actually, we have not seen that COVID is a major cause of seizure worsening as we had feared that it might be. Dr. Worrell, do you want to add anything to that? We can't hear you. I don't know if you're on mute.
Yes, I think that's true. And I think when you look at the study in New York that actually looked at more anxiety from COVID and the things associated with COVID increasing seizures as opposed to COVID infection. So it's a lot of response to the potential risk of COVID and the impact that COVID has on our lives, but it's not so much, COVID infection itself causing worsening seizures.
And there have been studies also, by the way, of people who have been in the hospital with COVID, who have epilepsy, who have continuous EEG monitoring. And again, there's just no evidence that COVID, thank goodness, there is, as with everything else, there's going to be a rare case here and there where people do get worse. But the vast majority, that just doesn't seem to be the case.
Dr. Worrell, is there any concern for people with implants regarding the vaccine? Should they be concerned?
No, so there would be again no contraindications for people who have various types of neurostimulators or vagus nerve stimulators. I think those individuals should also go ahead and get the vaccine as soon as they are able to.
Thank you. So this question is going to be, I think, a combination question for both Dr. Freymau and our epileptologists on the call. So if someone has epilepsy and a neuromuscular disorder, and after receiving other vaccines did not develop full immunity, should they still go on and get vaccinated?
Wow, I think I'm going to throw that to Dr. Freymau.
So every vaccine is different in terms of how effective it will be. And we know that there are people who respond better to one vaccine than another. We also know that our tests for measuring immunity are not necessarily perfect. We know many people who've gotten a couple of doses of mumps, measles, and rubella vaccine. We know that they're immune, but their antibody tests don't show that they're immune. So there are other ways that the body makes immunity. So we would strongly encourage you to get the vaccine, and we can't guarantee that everybody is going to respond equally well to the vaccine, but that's not a reason not to get it.
And I just want to say for the three of us sitting here that none of our lives have changed. We still social distance, we still mask up, we still, do all of the precautionary things that we did before. And unfortunately, everybody's going to have to do that. So this is all of that protection plus additional protection, whatever you get from the vaccine. That can't be bad. What would be the mistake is to get the vaccine in that circumstance and then go to your school dance. That would not be a good idea.
Mhm.
So Dr. Fremow, you discussed a little bit about side effects, that you had a little bit of a sore arm, and then the second dose, you felt a little fluish but felt better. What's the full spectrum of side effects that people might experience when they get the vaccine?
Well, most of the people that I talked to with the first dose had almost none. The most common one was some arm soreness. Uh, the next most common was a few people felt a little bit tired that day or sometimes the next day as well. Occasional mild headache. Um, the second dose, the side effects were similar, but I think more common. We've now had in our hospital, since we started giving out second doses last week, we've had, well over 1,000 people who've gotten their second dose. And like I said, a very, very small number felt unwell enough or tired enough or achy enough that they didn't come to work the next day.
And
Thank
high
you.
fever can happen. I
Mhm.
mean, I have heard of fevers up to 104, but that is not the norm. It's still rare, but it can happen.
We did get a question about what the Epilepsy Foundation has done to ensure access to the vaccine for people with epilepsy. So I want to talk a bit about what our advocacy team has done. We advocated for people with epilepsy to get the vaccine at the appropriate phase of vaccine allocation. And this was through a very strong and determined action of our advocacy team. They worked very, very hard on the Hill for this. And due to their hard work, they were able to make changes to the recommendations so that people of all ages and congregate settings were included in phase 1A of the vaccine rollout, which we mentioned early on. It was also part of their work to expand the term healthcare personnel was more broadly defined to include home health workers. This ensured that people with epilepsy who live in congregate settings, like long-term care facilities and their related caregivers, were not left behind in receiving the vaccine. So I really want to shout out our amazing advocacy team. This was a lot of hard work for them. They worked tirelessly on the Hill to make sure that these really important people were not left behind. So round of applause for them. Really awesome work. Throw some stars in the comments for them. So I really wanted to shout them out to make sure that they're included. Someone had a question about, is there anything that you can do to keep your immune system up, as we're going through this? Dr. Fremow, anything that you could recommend?
So I think that probably the things that you can do, I mean, I'm sure you can go to the health food store and see shelves and shelves full of supplements. How well they work and whether they're beneficial is maybe a little bit suspect. But the things that you can do, one is you can get enough sleep. You can eat a healthy diet. You can get some exercise. All of those things, which probably many of us are not doing now during this pandemic. Many of us are sleeping poorly. Many of us are at home, not exercising enough, eating too much junk, gaining those COVID pounds. So just trying to maintain a healthy lifestyle is the best thing that you can do to keep your immune system intact.
That's good advice around the board. I think especially with the shift of working from home, I know I haven't been getting enough exercise. So luckily we have the epilepsy walk, which is going to be coming up soon, so people can get out there and start walking. Someone wanted to know, is there any side effects on the vaccine on medication effectiveness? Is there any concern there, Dr. French?
No, thank goodness there's no interactions that anybody has to worry about where it would affect their seizure medicine. Good question, no concern.
Great. Lots of questions rolling in. So if our speakers are you able to hang on here for about 10 more minutes?
Sure.
Great. So if someone's had a seizure after getting any kind of vaccination, what would your recommendations be for them when approaching the COVID-19 vaccine? Dr. French, can you answer this one?
I would say that, there's going to be a circumstance, there's going to be a when and a how. That is something you should speak to your own neurologist about, whether there should be a specific concern for you or not. Probably that neurologist will give you some reassurance, but every situation is different. So just speak to your neurologist.
Great. Yeah, always important to talk to your providers if you have any questions. Is there any concern for those who have epilepsy and another health condition? So if they have epilepsy and autism, for example, or epilepsy and cerebral palsy?
So I think that those individuals should clearly get the vaccine as quickly as they can as well. I think the biggest concern is if you have epilepsy plus another what we would consider a high risk condition, so something that would impact on your heart function or something that would impact on your ability to breathe, some breathing issues or diabetes. But I think there is no I would certainly would go ahead if it was epilepsy and autism or other conditions. I would strongly advocate getting the vaccine.
Thank you. Someone did have a question about COVID-19 itself, which I think is important to ask as this pandemic is still going on. If you have COVID-19, you have epilepsy, and you are not feeling very well, and it's affecting you quite a bit, can you still take your anti-seizure medications? Dr. Worrell, could you answer this?
Yes, and so you should continue to take your anti-seizure medications because we know that, COVID probably causes some degree of stress to the body with a more severe illness, more severe stress. We know stress is actually a big trigger for seizures, and the last thing you want to do is stop taking your medications because that gives you two reasons to potentially then have breakthrough seizures. So absolutely, you should be taking your medications. If you're having a lot of vomiting, you can't keep those medications in, you should definitely call your provider.
Thank you. And somebody just wants clarity because they heard you say this, that if you have diabetes and epilepsy, you should be taking some more precautions, correct? And get the vaccine when you can.
That would be considered, I think, Dr. Framo can correct me, but I think diabetes is considered one of the factors that is higher risk for more severe COVID infection. So absolutely.
Yes, diabetes is one of the more important underlying medical conditions that would put you at risk for potentially a more serious outcome from a COVID infection.
What about if you have epilepsy and asthma? Dr. Framo, could you answer this?
Yeah, in asthma, so again, there are a number of underlying conditions or predisposing conditions that are associated with doing worse with a COVID infection, meaning more likely to end up in the hospital, more likely to end up on a ventilator, diabetes, having obesity, having a high body mass index, hypertension, any underlying lung problems, any underlying immune suppressing condition, all of those are associated with doing worse. In addition, we know age in and of itself, and we already talked about why age and higher age groups are in those higher priorities, and the highest priorities are older age individuals who also have other underlying conditions. But if you're young with these underlying conditions, you're at increased risk as well.
Thank you. Dr. French, so if someone has a seizure after getting the vaccine, is that being tracked in any way?
Interesting that you say that. The answer is at the moment, no. We have talked about doing some sort of observation system, but we haven't quite figured that out yet. We're definitely looking into it. There are systems that are more generic. So I know that Dr. Framo and I are signed up. I don't know about Dr. Worrell, and something called vSafe. You have vSafe as well.
Yeah.
So it's when you get the vaccine, You are asked to download an app on your phone, and every day the app asks you, have you had any symptoms today? So that would pick up the normal ones like muscle aches and fever and other things. But there's also a place to write in if you have something that you think happened to you that was related to the vaccine. We are also probably going to send out surveys later on when more people are getting the vaccine, just to see how they fared with it.
That's great. Having that data is really important. One question we got, and this comes up a lot for me as a person with epilepsy, sometimes I go get a procedure or I get the flu vaccine and I get the question if I have seizures or a seizure disorder. And that can be kind of alarming because I'm like, why do they need to know that? Should I even be doing this? Should I just, what do I do? So if that's a question people are going to be asked when they get the COVID-19 vaccine, why are they being asked that question? Dr. Frema or Dr. French, one of you answer.
I was not asked it, and I don't think anybody else was either.
No, it's not on the list of questions that we're routinely. I mean, there's a generic question about underlying conditions, but that's not one of the things. One of the things we do ask are you pregnant? Have you had reactions to medications in the past? But have you had anaphylactic reactions? But epilepsy or being on seizure medications is not something that we ask when people come and read the information sheets for the COVID vaccine.
So be reassured.
So thanks everyone for giving your questions and for our amazing speakers for their expertise and for giving their time this evening. I just want to wrap up our Facebook Live and ask each of our speakers to give just a few closing thoughts if they don't mind. Dr. Freymow, anything you want to close out the Facebook Live with?
Well, I just want to let everyone know we know how bad COVID can be. We know the short-term consequences. We're learning the long-term consequences. We know much more about this vaccine in a very short amount of time than pretty much any vaccine that has been rolled out. And I think that it's a highly effective vaccine. It's a safe vaccine. And I think the more people that we can get to be immunized will help us bring this pandemic to an end sooner.
Thank you. Dr. French, any closing thoughts?
I just want to reassure everybody that you are different if you have epilepsy in so many ways, and that's really unfortunate. But the happy news is that as far as the vaccine is concerned, you are the same. So there's no major concerns for you, more than there is for anybody else. And as you heard Dr. Freymow say, there aren't concerns for everybody else. So we strongly encourage everybody to protect yourself, because we know that COVID-19 is bad. None of us want to get it. And we finally have an opportunity to get out of the hole that we're in.
That's really exciting. I think we're all looking forward to that day. Dr. Worrell, any closing comments?
So I think it's really important to kind of balance the risks. I think we can all kind of get very worried about, is there a rare side effect that maybe we've not heard about, or, maybe there's a 1 in a million of anaphylaxis or something like that. But I think it's also really important to think about the risk of not getting the vaccine. And we know, as has been said, that COVID is a really devastating disease. It can certainly, over 1 in 1,000 Americans have died from it. And that number is only going up. And so as Dr. French has said, I think it's been clearly shown to be effective. It's very, very safe. And I think in my mind, the risk balance ratio is very, very much on the side of getting the vaccine.
Thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you to our speakers. We have a lot of comments thanking you all for speaking with us today and for giving your time and for providing reassurance to this community. It's so valuable. So thank you so much. And I hope everyone has a great evening and a wonderful week. And we'll see you for our next Facebook Live on Thursday about medication adherence. That'll be at 5 p.m. So make sure to join us then too. Thanks, everyone.